We come now to hopefully what will be the last video in this particular second unit of our study together as we conclude our study of the Gospels and the life of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus. And what we're going to try to do in this video is address the topic of the Passion of Jesus, referring, of course, to Jesus's arrest, his crucifixion, and resurrection. And all of these events are condensed into a single week. 40% of the Gospels dedicate their narrative to the events related to this last week. And so we are going to do what I've suggested we should not do, and that is take the Gospels and mix them together. But we just don't have the time, and you probably are not as interested in working through the last week of Jesus 4 different times. But I do recommend that you might look at that and do that in your individual reading and study. But for the purposes of our time together here, I have prepared a handout, and so you might want to look on Moodle for that handout and print it out. There you will discover basically the material that's on the PowerPoints already now in a printed format, and then you can take whatever notes or thoughts you have here. Because there's so much material, I wanted to make sure that you had as much support as possible. And there's a number of the slides that I'll be coming back to when we meet for class to go into greater depth and that kind of thing. So again, just encourage you to have your Bible handy, encourage you to go ahead and make notes of things that you have questions about, of anything that I say or something you've read, or how we can best help you master this material. So let's go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint. And of course, it's called The Passion of Jesus. And let's see here. I'm sorry. I'm not sure I'm getting this done right. Here we go. And so you see here in this introductory material that we just have the days of the week. And so my encouragement to you is to simply, let me try to move this up here. I'm sorry. I don't seem to be very well organized here. Let me go back, sorry. So therefore, if you simply think about the days of the week and you know what happens on each day of the week, then you've got this material pretty well mastered in some respect. And again, for those of you who are copying all this down, you'll see that it's on the handout here. And so let me encourage you to refer to the handout. Just making a couple of observations about this particular week is that, first of all, most of the events, all the events actually occur in Jerusalem. And so geographically, we are located in Jerusalem. Jesus has come to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. So again, if you go back and tie into some of the things that we've talked about this so far this semester, is that if you're a good Jew, no matter where you live in the world, you come to Jerusalem at least once a year. And so Passover is one of those high celebrations. You remember the Passover is rooted in the Exodus event. It was the last plague that caused Pharaoh to relent and let the people go. And so, so this is the event that people by the thousands are coming to Jerusalem for, and this is where we find Jesus and the disciples. Now, as you see on the handout or PowerPoint, the week begins with Sunday. Sunday is always the first day of the week. Just take a look in your personal calendars, and you'll notice that Sunday is the first day of the week. So Sunday was a typical work day, kind of equivalent to our Mondays. The Sabbath for the Jew was on Saturday. And to be even more specific, the Sabbath began at sundown on Friday and continued through sundown on Saturday. So in Jewish observance, the next day begins at sundown. So for those of you who do hate Monday, you can just assume that Monday begins at sundown Sunday. You sleep through half of it. When you wake up Monday morning, Monday's half gone. So that might give you some solace there. But anyway, Jesus certainly would have arrived in this area prior to Friday sunset. And we are told that Jesus is stationed in Bethany. Now, Bethany is just a couple of miles northwest of Jerusalem. And according to the Gospel of John, this is where Lazarus and his sisters live. And so we're just assuming that this is home base for Jesus. And so every day, Jesus and the disciples walk into Jerusalem from Bethany, which would have been probably less than an hour's walk. So Jesus does not come into Jerusalem on Wednesday that we're familiar with. And when he does come in on Thursday, of course, he's arrested that Thursday evening. And so consequently, he does not return back to Bethany because his arrest leads to his crucifixion and burial, all this occurring in Jerusalem. All right. So we have that picture there to reflect on. And then as you see the events of the week, you might think that they sound very familiar. And in fact, Passion Week on the Christian calendar is often referred to as Holy Week. And so as you look at that calendar, you see, for example, on Thursday, we have Jesus having the Last Supper, as it's referred to, on Thursday with his disciples. And some call this Maundy Thursday, M-A-U-D-Y. Comes from the Latin, taken again a passage from John, a new commandment, a modiment. And so Maundy Thursday, some churches have a service. Then we have Friday when Jesus is crucified. On the calendar, this is known as Good Friday, of course. And it's believed that maybe initially this was known as God's Friday or God's Day. And then over time, because of what had been sacrificed on the cross, we know it as Good Friday. It's been good news for the individual. And then, of course, the Holy Week, the Passion Week, concludes with the following Sunday that we know as Resurrection Sunday or Easter. And so this is a very holy time, and a time when a lot of people do a lot of introspective work and go to extra church services and have different rituals and those kind of things. It's all based around the important events that occur during this last week in Jesus's life. So let's go ahead and move into that first day, which is Sunday. So again, you'll see that as we come to each day, I've got some scripture there. And if we were in class, we would take time to read the scripture. And so I'm assuming you're stopping the video and taking time to read this particular scripture. So my comments are within context and make sense. And of course, even though this will be a longer video, it's going to be longer yet because you're pausing and reading the scripture as we would do in class. So again, you see the information here on this particular Sunday. And so the notes here are also in the handout. Well, what do we have on this Sunday? On the Christian calendar, this particular Sunday, 1 week before Easter, is known as Palm Sunday. And it's known as Palm Sunday because when people hear that Jesus is coming, the people go wild because Jesus has a reputation. People know about him. Now, again, I was not there. You weren't there. But I think we can apply some common sense to this. So see if this makes sense to you. Many of you, I guess before the virus, we tailgated. We went to football games. And some of you who are native Mississippians, and this would be true wherever your home team is, some of you do the Ole Miss or others do state football games, and you tailgate. Well, if we were in class, I would ask, if you go tailgate, do you go to the same place every time? And the answer would be yes. And the same people around you that are tailgating, are they there? And the answer would be yes. And so you have tailgating friends, you have people that you associate with going to these games. Well, I think the very same thing occurred. For some people, going to Jerusalem at Passover was the time they went. So it was just on the calendar. Everybody knew they did it. At that particular time of the year, we go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice. And so not only is that the time they go, but they have a place they stay. They have worked that out. And so here we have people coming all over. And can you imagine the conversation? Hey, Joe, how's it going? I haven't seen you since last year. How have things been? And especially for the people who live in Israel. Jesus, again, according to John's account, Jesus has been roaming the countryside for 2 or 3 years. And so Jesus, no doubt, is a topic of conversation. And so consequently, when the word is out that Jesus is approaching Jerusalem, those who knew Jesus or had heard of Jesus or want to see Jesus, they go to where Jesus is coming in. Now, the other thing to remember and to point out is that Jesus knows exactly what he is doing. And one of the points I want to make to you about this particular week is that Jesus is in complete control. He is absolutely aware of all that he is doing, and most of what he does has symbolic significance. And that goes to this event as well. As you read in the text here, Jesus has made arrangements, and he gets the disciples to bring him a colt, and he rides a colt into Jerusalem. All right? Now, this is highly symbolic. This has a lot of imagery. And you see there the Zechariah passage. It is a messianic passage proclaiming how the Messiah will come into Jerusalem. Now, one of the things that Jesus is doing clearly is enacting, putting to life that image that Zechariah has. It's one of the rare occasions, we go back and put this against the backdrop of Mark, it's one of the rare occasions where Jesus is saying, I am the Messiah. I am coming in to announce myself as the Messiah. And he is not only doing the aspect of coming in as riding on a donkey, which was seen as a beast of burden. It was a beast that did not proclaim anything but someone coming with no agenda. However, if Jesus had come riding in on a horse, well, a horse was a symbolic animal of war. And so what Jesus would be declaring if he had done that is, I'm coming in as a warlike Messiah, and I'm taking up the sword. But Jesus is coming in peace, according to Zechariah. And so consequently, the people go wild. And again, remember, who comes to Jerusalem but devout Jews, right? So they understand the symbolism. They understand Zechariah. And so they wave palm branches, welcoming him in as king. All right? So this is the main event that occurs on Sunday. Jesus is welcomed by the people. Now, by the time we get to the end of the week, you may be asking yourself, where are all these people that were so fond of Jesus? I don't think they were the same people. I think Jesus is appearing to a very small group of people at the end of the week, but we'll get to that when we get to that. All right, let's move on as we continue the week, and we turn our attention now to Monday. Again, remember that Jesus has returned to Bethany, and now he is making his way into Jerusalem. So again, I ask you to read Mark 11, 12 through 14. And what you see here, again, Jesus is very symbolic. He is enacting a parable. Now, I don't know anything about fig trees. And so here I give you a picture of what is a fig tree. And there, that little bulb there on the fig tree is a fig, okay? And so let's stop and talk about this for a moment. Again, as we've indicated, it's a short walk of less than a couple of miles into Jerusalem. So here the disciples are going back into Jerusalem with Jesus on Monday. And here Jesus stops and goes over to a fig tree and is looking for a snack. Now, many of you, even though you may not know about as much as I do about fig trees, you've eaten figs. Nabisco Cookie Company has a little cookie called the Fig Newton. And almost every mother will have some Fig Newtons in her purse or diaper bag because this is a great little cookie. It doesn't have a lot of sugar in it, has this little thin layer of sweet fruit in it. And so if your child is teething or wants something to chew on or wants a snack, a Fig Newton. And so I dare say you've probably had a Fig Newton as a child growing up as a snack or as some other kind of treat. Well, that's what this is. This is the fig, the fruit. It's very sweet, right? So I am told, again, I know nothing about fig trees, is that when a fig tree is in bloom, the leaves get very, very large. And so here's a fig tree saying in bloom, its leaves are large, and Jesus goes over and begins looking through the fig tree, looking for figs, and finds none. And so he curses the fig tree. Now, this is very strange, isn't it? What in the world could be going on here? And so Jesus has cursed the fig tree and resumes the journey. Well, can you imagine the disciples kind of, poking each other? Hey, what's the matter with Jesus? Did he have a bad night? He's in a bad mood today. Now, my argument is that this is an enacted parable, and we have to match this event to the next event that is occurring as Jesus enters Jerusalem. So let's go ahead and bring that slide up for you. And we see that Jesus comes in now to Jerusalem, and we have the so-called cleansing of the temple. So again, let me encourage you to look at Mark 11, 15 through 19. If you're using a gospel parallel, you'll find that this is recorded in some other events, the gospels as well. And again, I just kind of want to hold some of this discussion as when we come to class together, because I think I can explain it a little bit more. But here's an example of where we see Jesus being angry. And so the questions that I have for you is, what do you think is happening here? This is taking place in the court of the Gentiles. This is the outer court that we've described in class about the temple. And why is Jesus so angry, and what is the meaning of his action? And then when we cover that, I want to go back to the fig tree incident and ask you to give an accounting of what the fig tree incident has to do with the incident of the cleansing of the temple. So again, if you're absent for the class where we discuss this, hopefully we'll catch you up with a Zoom session or something like that. But be thinking about these things, reflect on it, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion about this. That then takes us then to Tuesday. And so Jesus returns to the temple area on Tuesday. And we have a variety of teachings. Now, we've already covered two of these teachings. One was on taxes. Is it right for a person to pay their taxes? And what is the greatest commandment? And so what we see in each of these cases is that the religious leaders are trying to trick Jesus. Should you pay your taxes? Well, if yes, you're going to lose the following of the people. If you say no, we'll go report to the Romans that you're being an insurrector. You're not supporting Rome. So, and what Jesus always does, and maybe this is a page we can take out of his book in our own approach to life. What Jesus always does is he finds a third way to go. And so Jesus doesn't say yes or no. He says, render unto God what is God's, and then to Caesar what is Caesar's. Well, they do the same thing here in this third incident that we haven't talked about, but we will now. They come to Jesus and they simply say, Jesus, By whose authority are you doing these things? Now you see what's happening here? They are attacking Jesus's honor. Think about that for a moment. You remember that discussion? They're basically saying, Jesus, what's your credentials? Where'd you go to school? Why are you doing this with such authority? Well, as you remember from our discussion on the challenge and response game that they played to attack and preserve honor, Jesus is required to respond. And so he kind of challenges them back. And he said, okay, boys, I'll answer your question, but you answer mine first. Who was John the Baptist? So you can imagine they kind of go over on the side and huddle and start whispering among themselves. And they know the score. They know what's going on. If we go tell him that John the Baptist is a crazy man, well, then what would be the ramifications of that? Well, the ramifications of that would be the people would go into a riot. For the religious leaders to say that John the Baptist was crazy? I mean, go back to our discussion about who John the Baptist was. John the Baptist was a prophet. He was one of the first prophets that the people had had in centuries. And not only was he a prophet, but he had been martyred. Remember? He had been killed by Herod Antipas. He had given his life to that which he believed. And now you say he's a crazy man? He was a fool? The people would not have that. They would have risen in anger and violence. So the religious leader says, well, we certainly can't say that. But they know if they come back to Jesus and say John was a prophet, then Jesus would have answered, then you know who I am and by whose authority I do this. Because John had identified Jesus as the fulfillment of what he was preaching on, right? The kingdom of God has come. And Jesus was the embodiment of that. He was the Messiah. And that's all the authority anyone needed to be the Messiah. So they were put, again, on between a rock and a hard place. Jesus didn't try to rationalize with them. He didn't try to answer their question. He just basically said, you answer my question, I'll answer yours. And it's not out of left field that he's asking, who's John the Baptist? He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly where he's going. And they do too. So they come back to Jesus and they say, I'm not sure we can answer that question for you. And Jesus says, well, then I can't answer that question for you as well. So we have these encounters on this second day, back and forth, challenge and response, people trying to bring Jesus in to some kind of conflict so that they can kind of divert the attention and deal with Jesus in a whole another way. But Jesus refuses to do this. All right, let's go on with the slide. And I think that takes us then to Wednesday. And here we come to Matthew 26, 14 through 16. Now, as we reconstruct this from the Gospels, it doesn't appear that there are any events recorded on Wednesday. So here Jesus, we can only imagine, is there in Bethany. He is relaxing. He is there with his friends. And we don't have any major events in Jerusalem recorded this day. But this gives us an opportunity to take a moment and pause and think for a minute about Judas. Because then some have speculated that Judas, one of the 12, he had gone back into Jerusalem and here made the deal to turn Jesus over to the religious authorities, to betray Jesus. And of course, Judas uh, is known in Scripture now and known in history as the great betrayer, right? I mean, just stop and think for a moment. Do you have anybody in your family named Judas? Do you remember going to school with anybody named Judas? Anybody on your teams or squads or whatever it is that you participated in? Anybody named Judas? Can you think of anybody in politics or entertainment or writers today who are named Judas? No. It's a name that people avoid because the very name of Judas is associated with betrayal. Now, here's my question for you. And again, we'll unpack this when we come together in class, but be thinking about this. Why does Judas do what he does? Why does Judas do what he does? Now, I'm not sure we're ever going to have a definitive answer to this question, but I'd like to share some insights and get your insights about what you're thinking. What do you do with Judas? How do you understand and explain? I mean, Judas has been with Jesus now for almost 3 years, and now he turns his back on him. He betrays him. What could lead someone to do that? So again, remember that the Gospels, I mean, one of the things that the Gospels say is that Judas was greedy. Well, what's happening is after the fact, remember the Gospels were written after the fact, they're reading back into the story. Let me just put one more log on the fire and then we'll move on. You know, Judas did have a job among the disciples. He held the money. Now, again, I'm just asking us to apply common sense and logic. You're going on a big trip with your friends, and one person's going to be responsible for handling the funds and taking care of tickets and all that kind of thing. Who do you pick among your friends to take that responsibility? Well, I think it'd be somebody who's dependable and honest and reliable and organized, right? So if the disciples had turned to Judas to handle the money, then he must have been all those things, don't you think? So how could someone who's obviously been held in high esteem turn his back on Jesus and become the betrayer? So think about that, and we'll come back and offer some insights. And again, nobody knows, right? Because we are not inside the mind of Judas. I don't know why I have trouble with this. There we go. So let's go to Thursday. So here it is later in the afternoon, and Jesus is gathering with the disciples. We turn to John 13, 4 through 17. They gather in the upper room, and here's, again, as I was pointing out earlier, sometimes on the Christian calendar, this is known as Maundy Thursday. And here we have Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Now, again, they are gathering here for Passover. So again, we've already talked about the significance of the Passover meal. And again, if you have had the opportunity to participate with a Jewish family or ever invited to participate with a Jewish family for the Passover meal, I would invite you to share that information with us in class, or if you have that opportunity to take it, because it's a very significant event, and it's one that will the memory of it will carry with you for a very long time indeed. This is not only a special event, a holy event, excuse me, but the Jewish family puts their very best forward for the Passover meal. The lace tablecloths, the best china, everything, and the food is delicious. But the supper takes quite a while. And the reason is because there's a printed program that families follow, And interspersed with the meal, they basically retell the story of the 10th plague and how they were enslaved in Egypt and Moses came and delivered them, or how God, through Moses, delivered them from slavery. And so it's a very solemn occasion, it's a very festive occasion, and at the same time, it is an occasion rich with symbolism. And so we can only imagine that this is exactly what Jesus and his disciples are doing. And once again, you have to understand what's taking place here. They're from Galilee. They're strangers in Jerusalem. So what they have done, they have rented a banquet room. And so here they're in this banquet room, and they're getting ready to have what we would call the Passover. And so they do. But before they do that, Jesus goes around and washes the feet of the disciples. Excuse me. Now, why does he do this? Well, again, it's hospitality. It's a tradition. In the first century world, you basically went barefoot or you wore sandals. And again, the parallel here, let's assume you've been on a long trip in the car. And when you finally get to your destination and you're staying at someone's house and you greet the person and you're glad to be there, it's not long before, maybe even before you sit down, you excuse yourself and go to the restroom. And it's not that you necessarily need to use the facility, it's that you just want to take a moment and splash some water on your hands and your face. You just kind of want to wash the trip off you a little bit, get refreshed. Ladies, reapply makeup. Men, comb their hair. Obviously, I don't do either one of those things, but it's an opportunity for refreshment. Well, it was the tradition that when someone came into a home, there would be a little bench there and a water pitcher and a bowl, and people, the slave would come to wash the feet. It was a sign of hospitality. And apparently, in this rented situation, there was no one to do that. And Jesus notices. And if we have the larger context of the meal, I mean, here the tables are set, the people are getting ready to sit down, and people are arguing who's going to sit where. And Jesus, who's the host of this meal, the host is the main person, right? He takes on the job of a slave. And he takes a towel, takes the water bowl, and he begins going around and washing the disciples' feet. And so sometimes in church services on this Thursday, this is a time of foot washing. Not all churches do this. And I know that probably some of you have had this experience, maybe at camp, and just in classes past, it's been a very humbling experience for many to have someone wash their feet. And surprisingly, it's just maybe a quirk of human nature, but a lot of us are kind of picky, another pun, about our feet, are we not? We don't like to maybe show them. We don't like for people to touch them. There's something private about feet. But yet, here we go, Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And it's not lost on those who are there of what Jesus is doing. He is the host, taking on the work of a slave. All right, so they sit. They gather here for the meal. And it is during this meal that I'm going to suggest that they're reclining. Now, we've already seen this when we dealt with the an introduction to the book of John in the last video. We have that testimony from Irenaeus, right? That he said the disciple whom Jesus loved, or John, laid his head against Jesus's breast. Well, that's an indication that they were laying down. And again, if this was a meal in a rented banquet room, they had probably adopted the Roman way of eating, which was to recline on low couches. So I want to kind of just go ahead and kind of pause the discussion here, because there's a couple of things I want to do in class with you that are better demonstrated to drive this point home and to make it even more interesting to you. But just imagine the disciples lying on their elbows, propped up with the table in a kind of U-shaped design. And so the disciples are sitting around eating, listening, talking to one another. And here Judas is identified by Jesus, as Jesus is aware of exactly what Judas is up to and what he's about. Okay, so I'm just now realizing that I need my whiteboard, so let me go get that. So I'm going to pause this for just a second, and I'll be right back. All right, I got it. So I know you're excited about seeing me use the whiteboard again. So Jesus has the meal with the disciples, and so it's a long, drawn-out affair. Now, we don't have a clock, okay? We've lost track of time. Let's assume the Passover meal would have begun at sundown. They're probably a couple of hours into it. And then as they think they're coming to the end of the meal, Jesus does something rather remarkable. And so he takes a cup of wine and he takes some bread and he begins talking in a way that they don't really fully appreciate or understand. And Jesus says, this, raising the bread, he says, this is my body, which is broken for you. And he breaks it and he says, eat this in remembrance of me. And then he takes the cup and he says, this is my blood that was shed for you. Drink this in remembrance of me. And of course, what Jesus is doing is he's making a transition from the Passover to what we as Christians celebrate today and know as the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper. And it's a commemoration of remembering of Jesus's sacrifice. And of course, here we have absolutely no, from the disciples' perspectives, they have no context for understanding what Jesus is doing. But oftentimes, and this is true, is it not, when something happens to someone that we care about, we go back and we remember the last time we were with them. And it's those events that occurred the last time that we were with them takes on special significance, does it not? And so consequently, I'm suggesting for us that what is happening here is that after the crucifixion and resurrection, as the disciples reflect back on their last time with Jesus, because the arrest is imminent, they don't know it, but the arrest is imminent, then these words that Jesus said about the bread and the cup, they take on additional significance, and now it becomes something that they did when they gathered. They remembered Jesus. And we'll see Paul given instructions about the decorum of this supper meeting. And so it's clear that this was a practice that was begun very quickly by the early church to remember what Jesus had done. So let me bring up that slide for us to kind of help us remember that. And again, if you want to pause and look at Luke 22:14 through 20, just reading off here the slide, what we see then, of course, is whereas the Passover was a reenactment of the Exodus, Jesus is taking this very familiar ritual, something they did have context for, and he's recasting that with a deeper, richer meaning. Now, whereas not all churches wash each other's feet, I dare say, regardless of your tradition, if you're a Christian church, you celebrate the Lord's Supper at least once a year. And for some of you, it may be once a month. Some it may be once a week. Some it may be once every 3 months, once a quarter. But I'm saying with some regularity, your church celebrates what we call the Lord's Supper. It goes by some other names. It might be known as communion or the Eucharist. The word Eucharist means thanksgiving. We're thankful for that which Christ has done as we remember. And so we can talk more about that in class if you wish. But again, we see the transition between that which is being remembered as the Passover and now being remembered as a new tradition of the Lord's Supper. You see them listed here quickly. The 10th plague did what? Slaughtering the lamb and putting the blood on the doorpost protected the firstborn son from death. Jesus is the firstborn son of God, but yet it's going to be his death, the sacrifice of his blood, that's going to be that which protects us from death. Of course, it's the blood of a lamb, as we just indicated in the Gospel of John. Jesus is identified with the lamb. Again, the focus on the firstborn. And then the Exodus event, of course, brought the Hebrew people into a new relationship with God. And so when we become believers and followers of Jesus, we are brought into a new relationship with God as well through Christ. And so consequently, the Lord's Supper, this meal, is simply rich with tradition. Let me take a moment here and look at the handout that I've given you to make sure that I'm not skipping anything of import. And so I think we're moving now to the top of the third page. So they adjourn and they move now outside of the city into a little hilltop area outside the city known as Gethsemane. Now, Jesus is no stranger to Jerusalem. And of course, if you go to Gethsemane today, go to Jerusalem today, you will see the hill that overlooks Jerusalem, where there's lots of olive trees. And in fact, again, there's not only a church, but a chapel that has been built there to commemorate these events. And so you can easily visualize Jesus coming here to the hilltop, overlooking Jerusalem. And what's interesting is he stops. He stays. Now, again, my thesis with you that I mentioned at the beginning of our time together here is that Jesus is in absolute control. He knows exactly what he's doing. We have the encounter during the supper where Jesus has this encounter with Judas, and he indicates, I know what you're about. You don't have to do this, but if you're going to do it, go. And so he does. Now, let's pause here for just a second and think about Judas. So again, we don't know what time it is. Just for argument's sake, let's say it's 10:30 at night. Well, Judas is gone. He's gone to get the Confederates, right? Jesus and the disciples leave. Interesting. Where do you think Judas takes those people that he had made the arrangements with? No doubt he took them to the very last place he saw Jesus. He took them to the room, the banquet hall, that they had made arrangements for. This is where they were. And can you imagine Judas' shock when they get to the room and it's empty? And you can imagine the soldiers there saying, I thought you said you knew where this guy was. You're leading us on a wild goose chase. Yeah. And Judas has to stop and think. And he says, well, here, let me tell you. Sometimes when we've been here, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's go there. And so they go. And of course, there they find Jesus. But here's my point. They only find Jesus because he is waiting for them. So here's my whiteboard, okay? And I didn't make a mistake here, and I went ahead and drew on it. But you see, here's Jerusalem. So here they come, they walk out through the valley, and they come up on a hillside here, which is overlooking. Now, maybe it's 11 o'clock. Maybe it's midnight. I don't know. The point is, Jesus could have kept on walking. We're in the first century. There's no infrared capability. There's no helicopters. Jesus could have easily escaped, but he did not. He is waiting for Judas to come. Isn't that interesting? Well, sure enough, here comes Judas. But before he comes, Jesus does take this time and he prays. And so here we have one of the most amazing prayers of all, and it's in John chapter 17. Let me just ask that you pause now and just go to John 17 and read that prayer. We talk about the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. That's the model prayer. Here's the Lord's Prayer. And you again can see the humanity of Jesus. Jesus does not want to happen what's getting ready to happen. He is asking God, if there's any other way this can be done without this happening, please let it happen. But once again, Jesus is our model. And he offers up, not my will, but yours. You see, this is why Jesus was without sin. He always did God's will. You and I are called to do the same. We see in Jesus' model of obedience, and we too need to be obedient. And the other interesting thing here in John 17 is that Jesus prays for you, and he prays for me, all those who will come to believe. And don't miss the other thing he says here, so that we might become one. Unity. We need some of that today, don't we? We haven't come very far, have we? There's a lot of work to be done. Well, here comes Judas. And to add insult to injury, he goes up to Jesus. And it becomes an iconic image, does it not? The action that we humans use to express affection and love and care. Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss. And Jesus is grabbed, and he's put under arrest, and he's pulled away. There's another little side note here, isn't there? Oh, Peter. Peter's right there. Oh, impetuous Peter. He draws his sword. Now, who knew? Disciples carried swords. And he pulls that sword out, and he goes up to a man that's coming in on to them, and he draws it and moves it in a way that he slices the man's ear off. Now, if you've ever had a head injury, you know there's a lot of blood associated with it. I mean, it's already a pandemonium, but imagine the situation just got 10 times worse. Can you imagine? This man screaming, blood squirting everywhere. Who's in charge? Who's in control? Jesus goes over and reaches down and picks up the ear and reattaches it to the man's head. And it stays. I don't know if you've been one of those that come to arrest Jesus, wouldn't you have second thoughts at this point? Interesting, huh? Well, all the disciples were told, flee. They run away. Peter follows along. Even though he's impetuous, he stays. The story continues. All right, let's see where we are. There we go. So here is some pictures of Gethsemane for you. We've already indicated that about the Jesus could have escaped. The rock there at the bottom is within the Church of All Nations. This idea that Jesus threw himself on a rock and prayed this John 17 prayer. And you can see the little gate that encompasses the rock is kind of done as a thorny crown. In Luke 22:47 through 53, you see Jesus being betrayed there by Judas in the upper left-hand corner, and then Jesus being taken in under arrest. And I take a picture of these steps here because in excavation, if they go to what is believed to be Caiaphas's house, and you see there behind the tree there, the top of the house that's been reconstructed, these would be the steps that Jesus would have come up through from the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is where the next thing is happening. It's going to happen here at the house of the high priest. This little chapel that I mentioned before here on the side of the hill of the garden, you can see here the gate, or excuse me, the wall of Jerusalem, and here's Jerusalem proper. So you're sitting up, and remember, we're in the central mountain range, right, and the foothills. So it is hilly, and so consequently we have a little valley here, and then we have the hilltop, and so Jesus could again have easily escaped in this regard. Again, you see the change in the geography here with the steepness there of the hill. The Garden of Gethsemane is here. In taking this picture of the Church of All Nations, I am standing with my back to the wall of Jerusalem. So you can see that this is a pretty large church, and this is the inside of the church, a very beautiful church, to commemorate where Jesus was before the arrest. So now it's somehow become very, very late Thursday, but more than likely we are early Friday, okay? And we're going to now have a Jewish trial of Jesus. These are the ones who have plotted against Jesus's demise. And why? Well, we can come up with all reasons. We talked about some of this, I think, at the discussion of the various Jewish religious groups. They all have their different agendas, but it's now a meeting of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And consequently, many of them see Jesus as a false teacher. Many of them see Jesus as a troublemaker. They all have their various reasons for wanting to get rid of Jesus. And so that's what they're about to do. They've now been able to capture Jesus away from the crowd, so they've kept any kind of uprising that the people might have done on Jesus's behalf. This has been done at secret. This has been done at night. And so Caiaphas is the high priest, and his father-in-law, Annas, is one who questions Jesus initially. But no doubt this has moved a little quicker than they had anticipated, so runners are probably sent now throughout Jerusalem to the homes of the members of the Sanhedrin, and they're being brought for convening there at Caiaphas's house. Now, again, we know from our study that there are 70 members of the Sanhedrin. We don't know how many are coming to this meeting. It may be that Caiaphas is just looking for a quorum. Maybe he's just looking for those people that he knows that are on his side. So again, it's just kind of interesting speculation, is it not? that if Nicodemus had become a follower of Jesus as a member of the Sanhedrin, was he known to be sympathetic to Jesus? Was he allowed to come? Was he invited to this meeting? We have no way of knowing these things. One of the interesting things that we do know is that the Sanhedrin, for being law and order, if you will, they proceeded to break their own rules and regulations. We know from historical documents of how the Sanhedrin operated, and so consequently, we know at least three things. One, they met at night. And of course, the work of the Sanhedrin was to be done during the daytime. Why? Well, if you're good, upright, religious people, you have nothing to hide. And so if you held trials and the conduct your business in the daytime, again, a matter of honor, just like we were talking about, the Jewish households would open their doors and windows so that you had nothing to hide, that anybody who wanted to walk by and see what you were up to, they could. If it was done at night or in secret, if your doors were closed, your windows were shuttered, obviously you had something to hide. So it's done at night. One of the big 10 commandments, of course, is thou shalt not bear false witness. And so it only took 2 people to convict. So they have a variety of witnesses, so-called witnesses, against Jesus, and they don't agree. And so that in itself should not have been sufficient to convict. So they had the false witnesses. And then last, we know that especially in very serious cases, especially if something of this magnitude, they would to adjourn for 24 hours after they find a person guilty. And of course, the reason for this is to let everybody cool off, get some food, get a good night's rest, be able to think about it, because maybe in the mechanics of the trial, emotions ran high. People said things that they shouldn't have. People are angry. People are just emotionally invested. And so this is a cooling off period. And so they come back after 24 hours, and then they deliberate in a much saner way, calm way, of what punishment best fits the crime. And of course, they do not do that here as well. They're immediate in their not only finding Jesus guilty of blasphemy, and again, what is blasphemy? It's saying something against God. And so the question is put to Jesus, are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, I am. Now, under normal circumstances, that would be blasphemy unless you were the Messiah. And so Jesus is the Messiah. And again, here's one of the great high ironies, right? These religious people should be able to recognize a person of God, and what they're doing is they're putting Jesus to death, or working toward that end. So there you have it, Jesus's trial. Now I got to take you way back to one of our first times in visiting together, and reminded you that when Rome came in, they took away the death penalty privilege of the Sanhedrin. That is to say, that they could not condemn someone to death, but they could not carry out the order. And so that takes us then to a second event, and that is more of the secular trial of Jesus. And let me go ahead and bring those slides up for you so that you can follow along in the handout. I think we're down now, coming up on the bottom of page 3, the top of page 4. But before we make that transition to Pilate, let's talk about Peter for just a few minutes. The image I have, of course, is we're at Caiaphas's house, and most houses, and of course Caiaphas would be one of the richest people in Jerusalem, if not the country. So he's got a nice house with a big courtyard. And it was incumbent upon the people who lived in Jerusalem to open their homes, open their courtyards, open their property for people to camp out because you had so many pilgrims that come in for something like Passover. And so Peter apparently has followed Jesus to Caiaphas's house. And here, as you would expect in these kind of situations, there's always somebody up. And so we're told on 3 separate occasions, someone comes to Peter and says, "Oh, you're with that guy that's in there." And on 3 separate occasions, Peter denies knowing Jesus. So we have Judas, who's the betrayer, and we have Peter, who's the denier. So Peter denies knowing Jesus. And again, we didn't mention it, but if you go back to the story in at the Passover meal, Jesus had indicated, Peter's declaring this long obedience to Jesus. Jesus says, "Peter, before the night's over, before the cock crows, you'll have denied me 3 times." Now, we don't know what the cock crow is. Normally, we would think of it like being a rooster. A rooster, cackles at various times throughout the day. Or if you remember the old comic strip, Wizard of Id, you have a sentry out there on the wall of the castle, calling out the time, 3 o'clock and all is well. That was also known as the cock crow. So whether it's that or whether it's an actual rooster, it doesn't matter. There's this event, and Peter remembers what Jesus had said. And then, of course, Peter is filled with remorse, and we're going to have this wonderful picture. It was one of the post-resurrection places where Jesus comes out to Peter and says, "Do you love me?" And asks 3 times, drawing, very clear parallel to what Peter had done in denying. Jesus goes through a process through which Peter and Jesus's relationship is restored. And then just kind of a heads up, when we get to the book of Acts, guess who emerges as the leader of the disciples, or now apostles? And that will be Peter. So, because the Sanhedrin cannot carry out a death penalty, but they're now wanting to do that, they've got to go negotiate with Pilate, because Pilate is the local authority representing the Romans. He's the governor. He's the first Roman governor that we really talk about here in the story thus far. There'll be 2 others in the book of Acts. But Pilate is Caesar's representative, and he has come to Jerusalem. Here, if you go back and remember some of the geography and the way we were showing the temple courtyard, the Romans built a little fortress, Antonia, there right adjacent to the temple, because this is where all the traffic would be. This is where there needed to be a garrison so that if there's any problems, Roman soldiers could be there, Johnny on the spot, to prevent any kind of uprising, because again, one of the things the Romans were concerned about was keeping the peace. So you remember that Pilate lived in Caesarea, so he would come down periodically for these high feast days. And of course, Passover would have been one of these high feast days. And Caiaphas comes before Pilate and basically says something like this: "We have found this man who is guilty of sedition." Now, right away, we know that Caiaphas is lying. The text is clear. Jesus had been found guilty of blasphemy, which was a religious sin. But Caiaphas tells Pilate it is sedition. Now, what is sedition? Sedition is plotting to overthrow the government, something against the local government. Now, why does Caiaphas do this? Well, if he had gone to say, "Pilate, we have found this man guilty of blasphemy," well, Pilate could have cared less. That's a religious issue. It didn't concern him. But sedition, yeah, that needed Pilate's attention. And there's a history here between Caiaphas and Pilate that is unhealthy. And you can go back to Josephus and read some of these accounts. But when Pilate first came into Jerusalem, he carried the Roman eagle, the standard that symbolized Rome. And he brought the eagle into Jerusalem. And when he did this, the Jews rioted because they felt like the new governor, had brought an idol into the very city, the very home of God, being the temple. And the riots were so severe that word got to Caesar, and Caesar told Pilate to stand down. So what we see here is there's this untrust between the two men. And so instead of Pilate saying, sure, go ahead and do that with my blessing, he says, well, no, bring this man in here. I want to see him. And so now Jesus has this second trial, if you will, here before Pilate. And so now we have kind of a variety of things that occur. Not only does Pilate want to see Jesus for himself, but perhaps Pilate had already heard something about Jesus. Now, I'm not making a big deal of it, and I don't even think it's in the outline, but Pilate's wife has had a dream. And she tells Pilate he needs to ignore this problem. This is something serious. So we don't know the background here, but Pilate gets into a conversation with Jesus, and he pretty quickly deduces that Jesus is just a country preacher, that he's not seditious, he's not planning an overthrow of Rome, he's no threat to Rome. But he's now kind of caught in a situation with the Sanhedrin. And if we go back to John 19:12 and look at that passage, according to the Gospel of John, there's a little blackmail going on. Caiaphas tells Pilate if he doesn't handle this and get rid of Jesus, then Caiaphas will go back and tell Caesar that Pilate's no friend of his. Well, Pilate certainly doesn't want that, especially since he's already been in trouble once, right? And so he's not in favor of that at all. So he does what Caiaphas wants. But Pilate thinks he's pretty smart at several levels here. So he sees that Jesus is not a threat. He learns that he is from Nazareth. So he says, I'll tell you what, Herod Antipas, the king of that area, is here, like a hot potato. I'm going to throw you to him. And so Jesus is carted off to where Herod Antipas is staying. Now, again, we've lost track of time. I don't know what time it is. I can tell you Jesus is going to be on the cross by 9 a.m. So my guess is that we're in the very early hours of Friday. It may be 4 o'clock in the morning. It may be 5. It may be, I don't know. But off Jesus goes to Herod Antipas. And yes, this is the same king that was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. So Herod Antipas has 2 roles to play in this New Testament story. I don't know if you've seen the Andrew Lloyd Webber play Jesus Christ Superstar. But in that play, when Jesus appears before Herod Antipas, Herod sings a song in the play that he's very delighted to see Jesus because he's heard so much about him. And he wants him to put on a show for him to walk across his swimming pool. Well, of course, Jesus has, and I know this is kind of strange to say, but I'm just repeating what is read in Scripture. Jesus has nothing to do with Herod Antipas. Because remember, Jesus had called John the Baptist the greatest man who had ever lived. And now Jesus is appearing before the man who had ordered John's death. So Jesus is simply mute. Maybe that's another lesson for all of us. If we don't have something good to say, we don't say anything. And so Herod Antipas is pretty bored with Jesus rather quickly, and so he sends Jesus back to Pilate. Well, this is where the blackmail kind of comes in, because what Pilate wants to do is release Jesus. So again, he thinks he's pretty clever. And it becomes a tradition that governors had some discretionary power that to show the benevolence of the Roman people, that he could excuse, he could forgive, he could pardon criminals. But he doesn't want to do, he wants to do it in a way that it can't be really laid at his feet. So he thinks he's got a brilliant idea. So here he's got Jesus, this mild-mannered preacher, but also in the cell, in the jail cells, he's got a captured prisoner that everybody pretty knows is a bad egg. And his name is Barabbas. Okay? Now, you all know who Martha Stewart is, right? She's a baker, but she was sent to prison because of some tax evasion of stocks and stuff. And again, many of you may have grown up hearing the name Jeffrey Dahmer. His name dominated the news for a while because it was found that he was a cannibal. He was a true Hannibal Lecter. He killed people, dissected them, and put their body parts in the freezer. When he was arrested, they found that. And so I think in Pilate's mind, trying just to make a parallel here he had a really bad dude. And of course, the scriptures don't tell us, but I'm thinking, this is my opinion, that Barabbas may have been a zealot. And if you remember when we talked about zealots, we suggested that a zealot was someone who, this has been going on for a while, my mind is starting to shut down. A zealot is one who went regardless of the cost. If innocent people got hurt, as long as the ends justified the means. So I'm guessing that maybe some innocent people have been hurt, that the common people wanted Barabbas locked up. So in other words, I've got a Jeffrey Dahmer, I've got a Martha Stewart, you know. What's the worst that could happen if we release Martha Stewart? You know, she can make you a cupcake. What's the worst that could happen if we release a Jeffrey Dahmer? You know, you could become a cupcake. So I mean, it was clear that people were going to vote and let Jesus be released. Well, we're told in the text that the religious leaders had gotten hold of some of the people in the crowd, and they convinced them to call for the release of Barabbas. Now, again, going back to what I'm suggesting here, how many people that are in Jerusalem are going to be up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning in Pilate's presence in the fortress? Not many. So the people that welcomed Jesus in on Monday are not the same people that are here at this presentation. Again, I wasn't there, but my guess is it was certainly less than 100. And so when Pilate gives the option, who should I release? Overwhelmingly drowning out the people for Jesus is the call to release Barabbas. And so once again, Pilate has painted himself in a corner. And again, in one of the most iconic images of all time, Pilate has a bowl of water brought and he washes his hands. Here he's the person in charge, but he washes his hands and he says, do what you want to do. And Jesus is turned over for crucifixion. Well, I'm going to continue this here in just a minute, but I'm going to pause and take a quick break and come back in a minute. But stay tuned. We're picking right back up where we left off. I'm back. Crucifixion. It was the way in which the Romans dealt with any kind of insurrection. The worst people in the empire, were crucified. Um, Crosses, you might think of them as billboards. Let me tell you a story about Spartacus. Spartacus, maybe some of you have seen the movie. He was a slave in Rome who led an insurrection before Jesus. This is time before Jesus. And several thousand slaves rose up against Rome. It was General Pompey, remember him? He was the one who was called in to quell the rebellion. And what did they do? They lined the roads to Rome with crosses. And people were crucified, they were put on the crosses, and consequently, they stayed there. They were left to rot. So can you imagine, whichever way you came into Rome, about a mile or two outside of Rome, you began passing cross after cross, seeing these decimated carcasses of bodies, human bodies, left rotting on these pieces of wood. It was clear. You don't mess with Rome. And so crucifixion was a terrible way in which to die. One died very slowly. One died by suffocation. So how does that work? Well, let me give you a picture here of someone on a cross. And you can see that in this particular case, nudity added to the degradation of the individual. Now, whether Jesus was nude or not, we don't know. In all the paintings you've seen, there's a loincloth that is worn. And it may be indeed that the Jews, in their modesty, had worked out some kind of arrangement that the man's private parts might be covered in some way. But nevertheless, the person crucified was put on the cross in some position like this. Now, there's lots of different ways in which crucifixions occurred. Again, I go back to the idea that the Romans were very, very efficient. And so if you've seen the movie that's often on television at Easter time, simply called Jesus of Nazareth, I believe it's the name of it, I think they probably do a pretty good job of depicting how the crucifixion occurred at that time. To think that Romans would dig a post hole every time they want to erect a cross, I think is somewhat silly. So what I think Jesus actually carried was the cross beam. And so here a person is carrying the cross beam. They make their way to the side of the crucifixion. And then what there's already there is some kind of lattice work where there's already post put in, and then there's pulleys at the top. And so all you do is attach ropes to the cross beam, and you pull the person up, bend their knees up, and then you crucify them, nail them to the established structure. So this keeps you from having to dig holes every time, and it's easy to put people up and take people down off a cross. So again, the feet would be put on top, and a nail would be driven through the ankle bone. Now, we're not talking about ordinary nails that you have in your workshop at home. These Roman nails were probably about the size of what we used in the when we laid railroad track, like a railroad spike. So they would be quite long, quite big. Now, just take a moment and kind of run your hand over your other hand, and you can see that in the palm of your hand, there's just a small network of bones, right? And so putting that big of a nail through the palm of your hand hand would literally pull off the nail. But if you come down here to your wrist, and you pre-med people or nursing people can identify what those bones are, but you have this hollow point in your wrist that could easily support a body hanging on a cross. So you run a big nail through this hollow point, even though you might puncture the artery here, you wouldn't bleed out because the nail would serve as a tourniquet there as it closes. And so in Jewish anatomy, the hand was considered from the wrist down. So to say that Jesus was crucified in his hand would still be correct if it came in here through the hollow point of your wrist. So here Jesus would be stripped. He would be stretched out on this crossbeam, nail, pulled up, push the legs up, and then there you have it. And so then what you do, and those of you who are in music or have taken speech, you know that when you speak from the diaphragm. And so the diaphragm is down here in your abdomen. And in this crunched position, you're in agony, right? But in this crunched position, your breathing becomes shorter. Okay, you can't breathe as well. So what do? You push yourself up to free the diaphragm. You bring in air, but in that process, you've got all your body weight going to your ankles. So that is excruciating. So you kind of lower yourself down. And so you repeat this process of rising up and going down until you become so weak you can't push yourself up anymore, and you literally suffocate. Your breathing becomes more shallow until you take no breath at all. That's how one died on the cross. And it depended upon what kind of physical condition you were in, depending on how long you would last. Well, hopefully this now helps you understand a couple of other things. What now are the Roman soldiers doing? They're going around after a couple of hours. So Jesus is on the cross at 9. We know he's dead by 3. So shortly after 3, the soldiers are coming around breaking the legs of those on the crosses. Well, why break the legs? Because if your leg was broken, you wouldn't have the ability to push yourself up to get air. So you would die faster. When they come to Jesus, they discover that Jesus is already dead. And so they run a spear up through his side, which probably transverses the body. And we're told in the text that both water and blood come from the side. So again, those of you in the medical field know that around the heart muscle, there's the pericardial sac that contains this just white fluid, if you will, that protects the heart muscle. So that tells us, most physicians agree, that the spear then pierced the heart muscle. And when the spear was removed, the blood from the heart and the pericardial sac fluid came out. And if you're a poet, you could say Jesus died of a broken heart. But I believe Jesus was probably already dead when he was speared. So there you have it. Let me see if there's anything else. So Jesus was on the cross for approximately 6 hours. Now, when Jesus was on the cross, and again, this is a compilation of the so-called 7 last words, and these are on your handout. I'm toward the bottom here of page 4. These are the things that are recorded from Jesus's statements. I want to deal with the 4th one in class, aware of an alienation from God. So we'll talk about that one in class, but just quickly going through these. Jesus requests forgiveness. One of the things that we talked about when we dealt with the Gospel of Matthew is that, one of the things that Jesus emphasized was to forgive one another. And so the first words from Jesus are, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We're told that he is crucified between 2 thieves. One believes in Jesus, the other rejects Jesus, and to the one who is repentant, Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. And so here I just take Jesus at his word. What happens to us when we die? We are with Jesus when we are in paradise. Where the only other disciple that is mentioned here present at the crucifixion is John. And so we have Mary, his mother. So again, Joseph is not present. So that leads into our argument that Joseph had died some time ago. And this very event, again, supports maybe my theory that Jesus was the oldest, because he now discharges a very important duty to make sure that his mother is cared for. And that would be the responsibility of the oldest son. And so he tells John, nodding to Mary, behold, this is your mother, and to Mary, behold, this is your son. And if you go to Ephesus, there is a place there that's identified as the home of Mary. So there is a strong tradition that Mary did go with John to live in modern-day Turkey, in the ancient city of Ephesus. Again, I'll deal with the alienation from God. This is my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He says, I thirst. So again, this idea of Jesus being human. It is finished, a cry of victory. He has accomplished what he came to do. And then the last words, into your hands I commend my spirit, and Jesus dies. And so once again, here's my thesis with you. Jesus is in complete control, and he even decides when he is going to stop living. And he does. All right. I think I've dealt with most of these things. Here we have another member of the law coming, maybe a member of the Sanhedrin, a teacher of the law. Joseph of Arimathea offers a tomb for Jesus's burial. And I didn't mention this, but let me just kind of go back here again. We see the hypocrisy. According to what Rome should do is leave the bodies on the cross, right? But more than likely, what most scholars feel like is that the Jewish religious leaders had a deal with the Romans that they would not have any bodies in Jerusalem on crosses for the Sabbath. That would be too sacrilegious, okay? So here we just see the stark hypocrisy. They have worked so hard to get Jesus on the cross, right? But now they're working hard to get him off the cross because it's going to violate one of the rules. So again, there's a rush, there's a desire to go ahead and get Jesus in the tomb. And so the area here that we believe that this is happening, I'll talk about in just a moment. Also at Jesus's death, we see a couple of other things that happen. Nature responds, just as we saw nature responding at Jesus's birth. There's an earthquake, it becomes dark. The temple veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place is torn in two, again, representing symbolically that no longer does one have to go through the sacrificial system to have their sins forgiven or to have access to God. I think one writer has put it that we better be careful now, because when the temple veil was torn, that set God loose. Remember, the temple was always regarded as the home of God. And now with the death of Jesus, God is set forth loose into the world. So there's some implications there. We I've already mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, we have the centurion, a Gentile, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. And then, of course, we have Judas returning the money and hanging himself. What we see here is a typical tomb. It's made out of limestone, usually a lot of limestone in this area, so the rock is soft. And so it becomes a family crypt. You create this opening where you can store the body, put the body, and you have a rock like that to cover the entrance, and you see the trench there to do so. And you can see my friend there who's just gives you a sense of a scale. of how big this is, but you could easily move that rock to keep animals out, basically. So what happens is that at the end of a year, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what happens is the body, when one dies under Jesus's condition or normal conditions, the body is taken home, and usually it's not uncommon, and it's even uncommon. Excuse me, it's not uncommon today. In Jewish life, funerals are held as soon as possible. Okay, and in Jesus's world, funerals were held the very same day that person died. So the body is laid out and washed and then wrapped. It's not mummified, but you have this seasoned, this fragrant cachet that you can tuck between the wraps as you're wrapping the body, and that's simply to keep the smell of the decay down. And so you wrap the body in this cloth and you store the body in the tomb. A year later, the family gathers and they bring with them a limestone box called an ossuary, Ossuary. And it's basically a bone box. It's no longer than the biggest bone in your body, which is your leg bone, right? And so they take the body. By now, the insects and things have done their job. So all that you have left now in the tomb is a skeletal remain. And so you gather the skeletal remains, the bones, and you put them in the ossuary. And so here are examples of an ossuary. And then the box is then taken and put in the back of the tomb. And so this becomes a family crypt. And so as you travel about Israel, you'll see all kinds of cemeteries that have been dug up, and ossuary boxes are all over the place. So there's that. Over time, now what's happened here, you see here in this picture, you have Jesus's tomb, the crucifixion place, and we believe it was done in the in a quarry. Okay. Then the earth is banked up in the 2nd century, and the Romans built a temple to Venus. But then with the 4th century, 313, remember Constantine? Remember his mother, Helena? She was sent to excavate and discover these places. And no doubt pilgrims continue to come here. And so the site of Jesus's burial place is uncovered. And she builds a church. And so this becomes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so then it is added to as we move through the centuries. And so today, if you were to go to Jerusalem, here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it's very interesting that it's been, it's actually controlled by about 6 or 7 different religious groups. One of the things you might be interested in doing, if you like this kind of stuff, is I think it's been about 2 years now that National Geographic did a very deep dive into the church, especially the sepulcher itself, because it was falling apart. And so under the supervision of National Geographic, all these archaeologists and restorers were brought in, and it was about a year project, and National Geographic filmed it. And they basically took the sepulcher apart, hadn't been touched in over 800 years at that time, and put it back together again. And so if you're interested in all this, I encourage you to get online and find that video, and you would find it very instructive. The church is just totally full of iconic pictures, and it's just, just go and enjoy and absorb. I'm upstairs in the church at a distance where the church encapsulates the crucifixion site and the tomb, the resurrection site. And so here this is almost, if you could see where the arrow is pointing here, if we could make a divide, one religious group deals with this side where Jesus is crucified, and another religious group deals with this where Jesus' cross is erected, okay? And here's a stone right there that they say this is where Jesus' cross stood. I know you're tired. I'm tired. I've been talking it's been almost 2 hours, hasn't it? I told you this would be a long one. We won't do this again. We won't do one this long again. But here, as you walk around in the church itself, you'll come across these, and these are abandoned graves. We're in a quarry. Truly, we're in a quarry, and these have been dug out, and this was a tomb at one time, okay? But this is the sepulcher itself. And so when you go in, you don't really see much. You see this little silver metal, iconic image of Jesus resurrected, but this covers up the tomb, okay? So it's kind of hard to imagine all this. So if you do go to Jerusalem, let me encourage you to think about this and do some advanced looking and reading so that you'll understand what you're seeing. So nothing happens. Jesus is buried on Friday. Saturday, nothing happens because it's Saturday. It's the Sabbath. And so Sunday morning is the first time anyone has the chance to do anything. Now, some of you might say, well, it wasn't really 3 days. Well, in Jewish understanding, any part of a day was a day. So from Friday evening until Sunday morning, even though it's technically only 36 hours, it was considered to be 3 days. And so who is coming to the tomb, right? It's the women. Again, how instrumental women have been in the life of Jesus. You know, we mentioned in passing in the Gospel of Luke, it was the women who underwrote Jesus's ministry. Well, the women are coming to the tomb to make the final preparations. They were in such a rush. The Sabbath was coming, the crucifixion, the emotional upheaval. Jesus's body had not been able to be properly prepared. And so here they come. Now, I'm pulling out now from our mixing of everything together. And what I would like for you to do is take some time now and just go through these 4 passages. If I can bring them up. There we go. Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. And look, very, very short verse passages, right? We have less than 20 verses that give a description of one of the most important events in all of human history. So we don't have a full description of what happened. And when you read these accounts, you're scratching your head because you're still not sure you fully understand. Just, for example, how many women went to the tomb? You see, not a full list of women's names are given. Now, this might disturb some of you, but I think this just really kind of solidifies the testimony of what actually happened. Some of you maybe are going to law enforcement, or maybe you're going to become a business person, work for an insurance company. You know, if you have an accident and you have a couple of witnesses and all 3 of you tell the same story the same way, the insurance company is going to suspect fraud. They're going to suspect that you've gotten together and gotten your stories together. Here we have 4 independent accounts of the resurrection. They don't agree, they don't contradict, but it gives a ring of authenticity that what is being told from this person's perspective as they understood it. And again, if you're in law enforcement, you'll be told that eyewitness testimony is often, it varies. It always varies. 2 people witnessing the same thing don't see the same thing. Isn't that interesting? So we have the account that Jesus is not here. He has been resurrected. He is gone. So we do have, after this, we have a number of appearances of Jesus, and you see those listed here on the bottom of page 5 of your handout. We've already talked about the Galilean breakfast. He appears behind locked doors to the 11. This is where Thomas says, I will not believe until I touch. On the very day of the resurrection, on Easter Sunday in Luke 24, Jesus appears to 2 disciples who are traveling from Jerusalem back to their hometown of Emmaus. In Mark 16, we have 500 who witnessed Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 15:7, James, a brother of Jesus, indicates that he saw him. And then, of course, we have the great challenge in the last appearance of Jesus by the disciples with the so-called Great Commission. And then Jesus ascends into heaven, and we'll deal with that when we turn our attention to the book of Acts. So we have numerous appearances in numerous settings over a 40-day period, we're told. But again, remember, we identified 40 days as being a complete period of time. So again, let me encourage you to look at those and read those as you go through that. What do we do with all this? Can we prove that the resurrection occurred? And the answer is no, we can't. And so I'm now on the top of page 6 of your handout. And so you can kind of look at that here for just a moment with me. All 4 Gospels identified the event occurred. Now, that's a weak argument because, I don't have anything that says it didn't occur. And stop and think about that for a moment. We've been pretty diligent in looking at all the various documents that's appeared in the 1st and 2nd centuries related to the story of Jesus, even going to Josephus. Don't you think there were people alive during that time, especially the religious leadership in Israel? Don't you think there were people who had a vested interest in proving that Jesus did not resurrect from the dead? But we have nothing. So again, I know that's a weak argument to argue from not having anything, but we have that. A stronger argument, I think, is the testimony of the witnesses. And so we're going to see, as we continue our study, we're going to see the ministry of Paul. And Paul could do something that we can't do today. He could have said, hey, man, if you don't believe this, what I'm telling you, here's a list of people you can go talk to. But third, according to tradition and according to the scriptures, those who followed Jesus gave their life, literally. Again, as I pointed out, as far as we know, all the disciples, except maybe with John, died martyrs' deaths. Friends, I simply ask you the question, who dies for a lie? I mean, I understand we can pull a hoax, but when I start threatening you with expulsion, failure, have your name ruined, imprisonment, death, someone in the group is going to say, okay, you're right, it's not true. But as we continue our study, one of the things that we're impressed with is the radical change in people's lives who said, I knew Jesus and I know he is alive. It's pretty powerful. And then, of course, what's even more powerful than that is for those of us who profess to be a Christian and say, I believe because Jesus has become alive in my life. Pretty powerful testimony. But again, you know what we're doing? We're believing and trusting by faith. And as I told you, the Bible is a book that informs and guides our faith. All right, just a couple of more things and we'll be done. This slide just won't move. Just some miscellaneous, this is kind of silly stuff. You might just have some questions, some wonderings about where the word Easter came from. It was the early church, eventually, especially after Constantine, they co-opted pagan holidays. And one of the pagan holidays was known as Estra, who was a Teutonic fertility goddess. And the animal of fertility that was identified with this Teutonic goddess was the rabbit. And of course, an egg has always been a symbol of new life. So consequently, what we have here is the name of the goddess. It became the name associated with the event. The bunny became associated with delivering eggs. And all this was symbolic of new life. And well, that's enough. Again, those of you who are very astute know that the date of Easter changes. Why does the date of Easter change? Well, after Constantine in 313, he called all the religious bishops together, and they formed the Council of Nicaea. And one of the things they did was establish the date of Easter. And so it was decided that the date of Easter would be celebrated the first Sunday following the first full moon following the vernal equinox. So who knew? It has everything to do with astronomy. It has nothing to do with religion. And so Easter will never be any earlier than March 22nd, and it will never be later than April 25th. Well, friends, here we come to the end of our story. The resurrection is crucial. It's the reason we're in this study together. It's the reason for Christianity. Without the resurrection, there would be nothing else. The resurrection was God's identification that what Jesus had said and done was absolutely true. We can have faith in who Jesus was. And it changes everything. It's part of that kingdom of God. What is the worst thing a human can be concerned about? What are we concerned about during this pandemic? That we might get sick and die. Because when we die, that's it. It's over. And Jesus has come into the world announcing to us that death is not the end. And in fact, the resurrection teaches us that death has been conquered. And we'll see that in the great passage that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians. But here's something else to think about. Jesus came into the world, and he gave his life in obedience to God. So God could use Jesus' life to accomplish that which he wanted done. If we are followers of Jesus, we know that Jesus is alive today. He is working in us. And as we live out that in-working of the living Jesus in us, then we too are to be obedient to God, allowing God to use our lives to accomplish what he wants accomplished. So how does it go for you? Are you living fully in the truth of the resurrection? Well, you've already seen the slide. I bring it up again here as we come to one of those stories that we dealt with earlier. And it was the question that Jesus asked Peter. And I'm suggesting that's, well, Philip. Oh well. Messed that up, didn't I? But you saw it. It's the question that Jesus asked Peter. Who do you say that I am? Don't tell me what everybody else is saying. Who do you say that I am? And so, friends, I hope that that's a question you'll struggle with and deal with. Because one day, I believe we're going to have to answer that question. Who do you say Jesus is? And it's my hope and prayer that our time together in looking at the Gospels and looking at the ministry of Jesus, that you are able to answer that question. Well, a lot to unpack this week in class, right? And I promise we'll never do a video this long again. But hope you're doing well. I'll look forward to seeing you. Study hard. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.